Welcome back to the Brahmin Word, and we are continuing on with our look at some of the misunderstood verses and passages in Scripture. And today we are going to be looking at another passage in the Gospel of Matthew. So turn to Matthew chapter 22. We're going to be looking at verses 15 through 22. This is very much a church and state talk and just kind of a passage, but yet it's not actually about that. That's the misunderstood part. So we will look into that in just a second. But let's read the passage first. Matthew 22:15 through 22. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him, being Jesus, in his own words. And they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us, then, what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax. And they brought him a denarius. And Jesus said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said, Caesar's. Then he said to them, Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. When they heard it, they marveled, and they left him and went away. So, uh, going through this passage, just like we did with the first one that we went through on Tuesday, we have to look at a couple things. So again, who's the author of this passage? It's Matthew again. I think it's interesting that he brings to the table his experience as a tax collector with this passage talking about taxes. If there was anybody that would know the inner workings of how taxes worked and how there could be a lot of corruption within the tax system, it would be the disciple Matthew. So this is actually a very intriguing thing that he puts in his gospel. Um, but obviously, it's not just about taxes, right? It's much more than that. But what genre are we in? We're again in the narrative genre. We are looking at the setting, which seems to be a more of a marketplace type setting within Jerusalem. But it's Matthew 22, so we're getting closer and closer when it comes to dating purposes. We're getting closer and closer to Jesus' death, which is showed in Matthew 26:27, and then his resurrection in chapter 28. So you have that coming up, and so being in 22, we're getting closer to that. The other thing that is really interesting to talk about here is the characters, because you have the Pharisees and then you have these Herodians as well. Herodians are a more law slash political. They are meant to think of Herod, so they are probably officials of some sort uh, within the Herod line. So that's who's being talked about when it's talking about Herodians there in verse 16. But you have this you have the plot, which is you have these debates of Pharisees and Sadducees and friends of Pharisees against Jesus, really from verses 15 all the way through the rest of the chapter in verse 46. So, but we'll get to the immediate context in a second because that's really important when it comes to this passage as a whole and really this whole chapter. The other thing that's interesting that we have to remind ourselves too is the theme of this book or this passage, and that is the theme of the book as a whole is that again Matthew is trying to portray Jesus as King of Kings. He is trying to show his divine authority, and he definitely shows that with verse 21, which we will talk about in a second. So, how is this passage misunderstood? It is misunderstood because it's this idea of, well, see, there's this separation between church and state. There is this um, separation between the two. And don't get me wrong, there is a separation, but it's not what you're thinking of. It is a separation of, it's not really a separation either. It's all about authority when it comes to this passage. Caesar has a certain amount of authority over a certain amount of things, but yet God has total authority over all things, including the people that he puts into place within human government. Uh, and I think that is where we see that misunderstanding, though, because a lot of people think that this is a church versus state passage. So, how should we, as followers of Jesus, respond to that misunderstanding of this passage? First off, it is not a church versus state passage at all. It is all about authority. And how do we know that? Well, first off, because of the immediate context. It's not like the Pharisees just stop at this debate and then they're done and they don't bring anything else to the table. No, they talk about the resurrection. The Sadducees debate Jesus about the resurrection in verses 23 through 33. They bring about, well, what's the greatest commandment in verses 34 through 39. And then Jesus even has a little debate with them in verses 41 through 46. And so that is all about this passage. It's not just this one off debate and that's it. There is this challenge of authority that the Pharisees bring to Jesus. Look, we don't believe who you say you are, but we also believe that you don't really have the authority to teach the way that you do. And so they bring these debates to him, and he basically shuts them up in a way. Verse 46 is the greatest example of that. Verse 46 in Matthew 22. And no one was able to answer him, being Jesus, a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. But the other thing that I think is really important is seeing the immediate context beforehand as well. Jesus is teaching again, he's using parables, and he's talking about how God is calling for everyone to come to the wedding feast, which is basically eternity. And many will be invited, but few actually go and be a part of it. Verse 14, for many are called, but few are chosen. And then you have these debates with these religious leaders. And it makes you go, okay, why is that followed directly after this parable in verses 1 through 14? My Again, it's not said explicitly, but my look of the passage and how it's split up and how it's written is that you are meant to think that the Pharisees and the Sadducees and these men of knowledge are should be the ones that are chosen, and yet they aren't. And that makes you go, why is that? Shouldn't they be the ones that for sure should go to that wedding feast with the Lord, but yet they aren't? So I think that is something that is really important going into this passage. Now, when it comes to the actual passage itself, you have this trap that is set for Jesus. You have him basically pitted in two ways that either he will side with the Romans and say, yeah, you should give them taxes, and that's it. And then the Jews which are very many at that time, that don't like the Romans, would basically throw Jesus in with them and not like Jesus. So you have that. But then the other side, if Jesus says, "Oh, you shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar at all," then the Romans wouldn't get happy, and they'd probably arrest him for tax evasion or whatever you want to call it. So it's a very good trap on the surface. Unless, of course, you're arguing with the Son of God, then, well, you're not going to win that battle. And that's exactly what happens. And sees right through this. In verse 18, the the start of this question is really straightforward. Why put me to the test, you hypocrites? It's not that Jesus is not he's not unaware of what's going on. No, he is absolutely aware of what's going on. If they wanted to just ask a question about paying taxes, they could have. But he knows their heart that is behind it, and that is wanting to get rid of Jesus. And so, therefore, that's why he starts that way. And then he asks for a coin, and then he starts to, and then he says, okay, whose inscription is this? It is Caesar's. And then he says this great line: "Therefore, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." So you have these hierarchies of authority that Jesus is showing. Basically, you have a certain authority, a certain amount of authority that human government has. Absolutely, they have an authority over different parts of government work, whether that be taxes, whether that be the defense of the country, whether that be writing laws, or what we would call the judicial and the legislative branches today in the United States. But you have those different areas where there is an amount of authority. But this phrase here, "and to God the things that are God's," it's not that God has a separate category and he does not have any control over human government. No, as Romans shows later on, as Paul will show in writing the book of Romans, that God gives the authority to the government. Even if they don't believe in him, he gives them that authority. And so ultimately, he is the grand authority above them all, but yet he gives a certain amount of authority to the government, and that is what is being talked about there in verse 21. Instead of a church versus state mindset, we should be thinking about, okay, God gives a level of authority to whoever is in government, but he has the authority, the ultimate authority, to remove them, to move on to somebody else. He has the ultimate authority to do that whenever he chooses. And I think that is the big part about this passage that is misunderstood, but how we should respond. This passage is all about authority and the fact that, yes, government has a limited amount of authority, but it's only given by God. And one thing that Sean McDowell said, if you recall, this is from 10 Most Misunderstood Verses in the Bible from Right Now Media with Sean McDowell. Sean made a great point. He's like, look, if there's an inscription with an image of Caesar on it, on the coin, and then you follow up with, "and to God the things that are God's," it's interesting because you would have to ask the question, where is God's image? Well, the image of God is all around us in creation, but specifically, we are created in the image of God, the Imago Dei. And I think that is incredibly interesting and incredibly encouraging. So, with that being said, hopefully, when somebody brings up this passage to you, or specifically verse 21, and says, "Oh, see, church and state," you could say, "Look, yes, God does give a certain amount of authority to human government, but He has the ultimate authority." And he will do what he wills in the time that he wills. And hopefully, when those folks that bring that to you hear it, they will be marveled just like the Pharisees were marveled in verse 22. So, with that being said, thanks for spending a little bit of time with me with the Brahmin Word. I will see you next week as we continue with more misunderstood verses and passages in the Bible. See you then.